So, hello everyone. As you are getting settled in our glorious Zoom event, um, I'm just going to introduce things and say hello to you all. The we didn't set this up as a webinar kind of event, so it's totally optional if you want to have your video on, but I would ask you to keep your audio off unless you're asking a question. Um, just because like that adds to, it can get confusing really fast. And we have a lot of folks who are here today, which is really exciting. My name is Andrew Munson, and I'm the founding editor of Essay Daily, and I do some other stuff too. We started this Salon series in, I guess we did their first one in October, or maybe it was even September, in part because Essay Daily is a website that is designed to kind of foster conversations between writers of nonfiction. We want people to be talking with each other about the essay, a thing that we don't think we get enough of in this day and age, even though there's a lot of talking like online in general. And as we all got pandemicked and quarantined, some of us kind of got lonely and thought maybe it'd be fun to actually have a Zoom event, both like bringing people together here to talk about questions that we think are interesting, but also to direct y'all to writers that we think are interesting and that had a book and have that we'd love to talk about in a concrete way with. So a couple words about Essay Daily. If you don't know who we are, you should check us out. We're at essaydaily.org. You probably already know this. We publish essays pretty much every week, not always, and sometimes like during Advent. You can see the calendar here behind me a little bit. We do an Advent calendar every year where we publish an essay a day during Advent. And this year it's liturgical Advent that started on the 29th. So today's the second day of it. And so just stop in the website anytime you want to read the essays that people are publishing. We've got a lot of really great stuff going up there. And we'd love for you to be part of that. And you can open up a new little door in the calendar every day and read an essay about typically an essay that we love or the writer loves. Today we had Pamela Pierce writing about Melissa Falaveno's Tomboyland, in particular, her essay about Twister. And then there's like a long riff on watching the show Friday Night Lights also. All of these things are good things. Actually, Twister is a very bad movie, but it is a really good essay about a bad movie. So you can go to essaydaily.org to read all of those. Another note just to mention, you probably noticed, but we're recording this event for posterity and for later perhaps transcribing. We may spin it out a little bit into a longer interview on our blog post. So I'm going to introduce briefly Kati and Kelly, who are our featured writers here today. And I'm just going to ask them each to read for a few minutes. And just as a kind of like, I don't know, palate cleanser, introduction to their work, although I imagine that most of you already know one or both of these writers, especially if you read Essay Daily, you probably will have read a good amount of Kati. We've had a lot of Kati on Essay Daily, and she's one of our old school contributors, and we'll hope to get more Kelly in the future. So I'm really happy to be here today with two writers whose work I've admired for some time, Kati Standefer and Kelly Sundberg, as we talk about the journey between publishing an essay and writing and selling, or perhaps selling and then writing, as often happens, a book. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly here. Kati's new book, Lightning Flowers, My Journey to Uncover the Cost of Saving a Life, was just published by Little Brown Spark. You may have seen it. It's been getting a lot of great press and a lot of great traction. Kati was one of my students in my workshop here at Arizona a while back. We don't need to talk about how far back. So her particular brand of genius has been apparent to me for quite some time. But many readers have been introduced to her work through an essay she published, Shock to the Heart, in the Colorado Review in 2015. That was, I think, the first published kind of instance of this book, the thing that Lightning Flowers sort of grew out of. Or through In Praise of Contempt, an essay that won the Iowa Review in Nonfiction, judged by Wayne Kestenbaum, who's an essayist that I love. And if you don't know Wayne, you should read some of his work. It's fantastic. And that essay went on to be reprinted in the Best American Essays, 2016. I first discovered Kelly's work through her Guernica essay in 2014, which is It Will Look Like a Sunset, which is probably an essay that you know. It seemed like an essay that pretty much everyone I knew was reading or talking about. And it was really a great moment in essaying. Like all of a sudden an essay went viral. And what's better, it was a good essay that went viral, an essay that was a blast to talk about in classes. And it really connected with a lot of people. So later that essay got reprinted in Best American Essays 2015. And you may notice in the front matter of the book, Goodbye, Sweet Girl, published by HarperCollins in 2018, a line citing, quote, material adapted from It Will Look Like a Sunset. And I mean, imagining our conversation today is a kind of request to unpack that statement, the one sentence that sort of appears in the front, and the years that it took between the one thing and the other thing. So I'm going to ask Katie to read briefly here first, and then I'll ask Kelly to read, and we'll go. If you think of questions, you can pop them in the chat. We will get to them if we can, or to as many of them as we can once the readings are done. So Katie?
Thank you, Ander. It's so fun to be here. I decided to just read the prologue of my book, which is Lightning Flowers. And I'm reading the prologue in part because the prologue is probably the section of the book that adheres most closely to the essay Shock to the Heart that Ander mentioned. And I'll talk about some of the adaptations in a little bit. Prologue, Tucson, Arizona, 2012. Nothing can prepare you for what it feels like to be shocked by an implanted cardioverter defibrillator. Like a badly spliced film reel, my memory of the night is fractured. In one instant, a player on the other intramural soccer team has fallen and the game stopped. He was getting up, brushing his thighs. In the next, my hands became claws. A maul cracked open my chest with a sickening thump, a hot whip tearing through my back. Did somebody kick in my spine? And then I knew, and I was screaming. There's no way you wouldn't scream if you felt it, my sister had said. By then, the defibrillator had been in my body for 3 silent years, resting loyally above my left breast, keeping watch for the arrhythmia that could send me to the ground unconscious, with a heart quivering rather than pumping blood. Now, on a crisp November night in Tucson, Arizona, I dropped to my knees in time for the second shock. What if it doesn't stop? I knew something was wrong, either with my device or with my body, but probably my ICD. If it were an arrhythmia, I should have been collapsed, unconscious, not sharp and alive like this, staring at the backs of houses at the edge of the field, their kitchen lights spilling dully out the windows as I screamed. Call 911! A third shock. You can either scream or breathe, a voice inside me said, and I began to pull in air, cold, heavy breaths, the way I'd learned to breathe into pain in yoga. I am either alive or dead, and I choose which. The device did not fire again. Can I get someone behind me? I called out. I don't trust myself not to fall. Someone cupped my back immediately, supported me to the ground, and the sky came into view. A ring of faces, the sharp white field lights, the smell of burning, which was me. There is a kind of dream state that settles over the body in these moments, a clarity that rarely visits us when our lives are busy unfolding. For lying on my back, looking at the stars, a question lodged itself in my brain, a wild constellation of if-then statements. If the defibrillator just saved my life, if a defibrillator is just metal, if metal is mined earth, if children sometimes work in mines, if tunnels collapse, if warlords profit, if women are raped, if mountains are dismantled and made toxic, if mined earth just saved my life, was it worth it? The thin branched burns that uncoil from the heads and necks of lightning strike victims are sometimes called lightning flowers. Fern-like, following the patterns of rain or sweat, they are rose-colored lightning bolts frozen onto the body, as beautiful as they are terrible. I will never know what my insides looked like after 2000 volts, if my tissue erupted into lightning flowers of the body cavity, a sudden bloom. What I do know is that the night I took 3 shocks to the heart, I was marked, called into the world in a way I could not turn away from. What can save us, I would learn, never comes without cost. Some people say lightning strikes cure blindness. This is my version.
Thanks, Katie. That was fantastic. And obviously, if you have not read Lightning Flowers, you may certainly go pick it up. I would highly recommend that you go pick it up. It's a wonderful book. Kelly, would you like to read for us for a little bit?
Sure. So I'm going to read a little passage from a chapter 14. It's called Christmas Baby. I am a Christmas baby. I was born on Christmas Day. And I thought about it because of the season, but just a little bit of warning. It's not cheery. It's not holiday cheer. We were in the car in the driveway of my parents' house. I stared at the light glowing out of the windows. Smoke drifted from the chimney into the darkness. I wanted to run away. I wanted to scream. He apologized, begged, maybe even cried. I couldn't look at him. I went into the house. There's my baby, I whispered, picking toddler Reed up and blowing a bubble on his stomach. And then on a Christmas Eve in 2009, 5 years after that Christmas 2004, there was this. And isn't this what this story is really about? Caleb hit me, fist connected with scalp. The meal cooked while Caleb screamed at me in the kitchen, and then his fist punched into my head. I felt not pain, but relief. Now I thought he will get this out of his system and he will finally stop. But he didn't stop. He never stopped. We ate the lamb roast and risotto cakes that I had made. I ate with my face swollen from tears and fist. I said, "Isn't this good?" He said, "Merry Christmas." I said, "Thank you." When I was a kid, I was always jealous of my brother. I felt that he was the favorite. Once I counted all of his Christmas presents and all of mine. He had twice as many as I did, and I presented the evidence to my parents. They rationally presented me with the counter evidence. My brother and I were different ages, and not all presents are of the same monetary value. Still, for some reason, I thought that love could be measured that way. I didn't know how to measure love in less tangible ways. Once, while Caleb and I were visiting my family for Christmas, he, my brother, and I went to a party at a friend's house. Caleb left early, and my brother and I walked home together. He didn't know how unhappy I was in my marriage. We talked about our childhoods, and my brother said, "I don't think that we experienced the same things." I started crying unexpectedly, and he hugged me on that dark sidewalk. I sobbed into his chest. I knew that I was not only sobbing about my childhood, but I couldn't articulate what I was feeling. I said, "You were always the favorite." He said, "That's true, but you were always the smart one. Would you have rather been the favorite?" I thought of that for a while, then sniffled. "No," I said. "I know," he said. I wiped my face with my sleeve, and we walked home in the cold December darkness. Caleb always gave me the most thoughtful presents, things that he knew I would love. If I liked something, it would eventually end up wrapped and in front of me. I had no interest in trends or expensive things. I didn't want diamonds or a fancy purse. I wanted earrings made by a local artisan, leather earrings with beads on them, a large red stone pendant necklace, a trio of prints made by an artist we knew, or a book written by my favorite author. Holidays with him were fraught, a mixture of joy and tension. He was a thoughtful gift giver, a wonderful cook, an attentive father. But the stress of travel combined with familial expectations induced his anger. If I asked him for help with the house or getting Reed ready for our travels, Caleb would scream at me that I didn't appreciate all that he did for me. He would bring up what he had cooked, the presents that he had bought for me. He would scream, "I give you everything you want, and it's never enough." I remembered myself as the little girl who had counted her presents. I saw myself as greedy, always wanting too much. I grew to dread Christmas. After Caleb beat me on that Christmas Eve, I had to wear long sleeves to his parents' house. At one point, I forgot. I pushed my sleeve up in the kitchen. My sister-in-law reached out for my arm. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft and low. How could I have told her? I don't remember how I answered. There would be so many more questions like that in the years to come. That Christmas back in 2005, our first Christmas together, Caleb and I walked our dog down by the river in Salmon. Our dog ran out onto the ice and slid into the river. I screamed. Caleb stretched out on the thin ice. He grabbed our dog's paws and pulled him out. Reed was 5 weeks old. As Caleb stretched onto the ice, I thought, I am going to be raising my child alone. But though the ice shook and heaved, it didn't break. The black water ran beneath it, hard and fast and cold.
Thank you, Kelly. Both stunning moments in the books. And so thank you for that. So the central question that we have is kind of wanting to know how you got from writing the essay to writing the book, both of which in both of these cases are super different. I mean, as you would imagine, because an essay is fairly short and a book turns out to be quite long, quite long when you're writing it. And I'm wondering if both of you would mind just kind of telling us the story relatively briefly, or in as much detail as you want, I guess, as to how you got from the one thing, the little hard thing, which probably felt like a big hard thing, and is a big hard thing, to a bigger hard thing, if it was bigger, and like how that happened, how long it took, what kind of the story was behind that.
I guess I can start. So I wrote the first draft of It Will Look Like a Sunset in one night in my bed when I was still married to Caleb. And I didn't have any expectation at the time that I would publish it. I just wanted to get it all out on the page. And then I went to get my PhD at Ohio University. And my first semester, I was in Dinty's workshop, Dinty Moore's workshop. And he asked Kirk and I to go first because we were the new people and I had nothing else to workshop. So I workshopped It Will Look Like a Sunset. And then Dinty, you know, I didn't know if it was good. It was so personal and so intimate that I couldn't, it felt powerful to me, but there's something about when you write something and you're not I wasn't emotionally removed from it at all. So I wasn't a fair judge of the material myself, but Dinty suggested I send it out to places. It got accepted at Guernica and then, you know, went viral. And I think I see a lot of questions in writers groups and stuff like, how can I write a viral essay? And if there was a formula, everyone would do it. And it certainly wasn't, I didn't expect it. And it was really, really stunning. And then after that, I kind of had a dream experience where it continued to get shared. And I was reached out, I had an editor from Holt, Henry Holt, reach out to me and tell me that when she had a book ready, she wanted to edit it. And at the time I had my book of essays from my MFA and I sent that to her. And then I did a reading in New York. So in October, Guernica asked me if I wanted to do a reading for them. It wasn't paid. It would involve me traveling there. And Dinty said that I could use my travel funding for that. And so one thing I will say for people who want to turn an essay into a book is a lot of it is about taking opportunities that are presented to you, which involves a certain amount of financial privilege, of course. And I mean, I didn't have a lot of financial privilege at that point, but I had that travel funding. So I paid to go. And while I was there, that editor from Holt took me out to breakfast and she said, we need to get you an agent. And she gave me a list of agents. I went with the first agent I had, but she looked at what I had and she said, you need a memoir. A book of essays is not going to sell. So we drafted a proposal. The proposal took me a long time. And the proposal took me, I think, I want to say almost as long as the book. I think I could write a proposal really quickly now, but for people who've written a proposal the first time is a real bear. And we were lucky. We had an offer within a few days from Harper and we gave it to her in a preempt. And I am very aware that like my high school English teacher says it's like a high schooler or like an actress that gets discovered in the grocery store. I got distracted because I saw that the book of essays wouldn't sell. Trust me, I hate that too because I'm working on a book of essays now. And and she still says that, but I'm like, well, I don't care if we get any money for it. I just want to have a good home. But It's exciting to get that kind of attention for your work. It's also disconcerting. It's not as wonderful, I think, as people think it is. And after I sold the book on proposal, I wrote mine pretty quickly. It took me, I said I would write it in a year. I wrote it in 18 months. And for me, I didn't want to take any more time because it was really painful. And I kind of just needed to get it out of me. So that's the big story.
That's great. Thank you. We'll return to some of that stuff. And we definitely want to talk about the sort of space between like the book of essays and doing it as a memoir, because I think that is a interesting thing to talk about for sure. Yeah. Kati?
Yeah, meanwhile, I took 8 years to birth. So I'm really appreciating some of the alignments and also tensions in how my story sort of sits beside Kelly's. So in 2012, I left Colorado to move to Arizona to begin my MFA at University of Arizona, where Ander was my professor. And I knew that I was writing a book. What? I knew that I was writing a book about the fact that I had passed out in a parking lot when I was 24 years old while uninsured in 2009, so pre-Obamacare, and had to quit my life in one place and move to a different state in order to access social services that would make it possible to get this potentially life-saving heart surgery. And how 6 months after that, I had almost died of sepsis and had this colossal breakup with my partner that I didn't totally understand in 2012, but I understood that there were some very big things I needed to write about in terms of death and illness as a young person. So I was a few essays into my MFA on the night that I took those 3 shocks to the heart, as described in the prologue. And it really, man, there was a writer in our program named Megan Kimball who was not there on the soccer field that night, but who heard about it, I think the next day in workshop. And she just looked at me and she was like, this is going to sound mean, but nothing bad happens to a writer. And of course, we both knew that, like, of course, bad things happen to writers. But what she meant, I had just had this workshop where I'd turned in a bunch of material about my defibrillator and my little sister's defibrillator and the sort of breakages of the medical technology that I'd been reading about in the New York Times. There had just been a big recall and there was so much. There was just so much stuff. And she had been like, you know what, I want you to know that this is how my first workshop felt when I had a book. Like, it's impossible to workshop an essay that's actually a book. And by getting shocked to the heart, there was this framing that presented itself to me, not initially as the answer to my book problem, but as the receptacle for my obsession. Which is to say that I couldn't survive being shocked to the heart 3 times without writing the essay Shock to the Heart. And for those of you who haven't read it, it was eventually published in the Colorado Review. It's very different from the book in that it's this sort of fractured, titled, braided essay in which there is a scientific voice that's explaining what's going on in terms of the technology, and there's a poetic voice that's trying to make meaning from like what it actually means to take electricity to the heart. And then there's this question really unfolding on the page about like how I fit into a lineage of people who have been electrocuted in an electric chair, shocked by tasers, or struck by lightning. It's like, what does it mean to be a part of this small group of humans that have taken electricity in this way? And our medical system views it as basically like a normal thing to happen if you have an ICD. I recently heard from a girl, now that my book is out, who got shocked 70 times in an hour at age 9. And I hope her medical practitioners dealt with her better than mine dealt with me, but they treated it as very normal. And so I really dug into not only writing about like what it meant to carry this box inside me that I had no control over, that could strike me with lightning at any moment from a clear sky, and my sort of like terror of it, anger at it. It felt predatory to me. And also the question that I described in the prologue had landed in my brain, which was like, what if the materials in this device came from situations that have real moral implications, and what would it mean for my life to be saved out of that space? And so being an MFA student was really perfect because I just started researching. I got really obsessed. I was at my first defibrillator factory within weeks of taking those shocks to the heart, which is kind of crazy to think about now. But there was a real ethic in U of A about like taking research opportunities and making the story that you're trying to tell bigger than you. And so I wrote Shock to the Heart, finished it within that first winter. I did hear from agents around it, but it wasn't big enough to carry itself because the project that I could describe to people still sounded very ambitious. I mean, it was. And I didn't know how I would ever finish it. You know, when I was talking to agents in 2013 and even part of 2014, I just had no sense of how the material would come together. And you can't sell a book on that. You know, you can't write a proposal on that. And these agents didn't feel like the right people. So what ended up being the real catalyst, I graduated in December of 2014. I was trying to work on the book the whole time, and had sort of this, I won the Iowa Review Award in the spring of 2015. And then in 2016, it got picked up by Best American Essays. So there were still sort of agents circling. And it was when the Best American Essays anthology came out. Oh, sorry, I just said something super confusing. So Shock to the Heart did not end up in Best American Essays. There was another essay that I wrote in the spring of 2014 while I was in Anders' workshop. Thank you. While I was in Anders' workshop, it was called In Praise of Contempt. That essay was not a hard essay to write. Interestingly, it was an assignment from Ander related to persona, and it's one of the few things in my MFA career that didn't quite come out whole. Like there was more essaying to do, there was more thinking out loud on the page, but it had a real narrative arc that I could work with pretty easily. And I was very warmed up at that point in the program. So when I submitted it in the fall of 2014 to the Iowa Review's nonfiction project contest, I honestly thought it had a good chance of winning, especially when I saw who the judge was. It just felt like this is the right essay for the Iowa Review for a Wayne custom bound contest. And it was. And so there was this thing that ended up happening in my life. In spring of 2016, my defibrillator gave me low battery signal, and I had to face the fact that I was having another procedure. And sure enough, when they went in to do that procedure, we learned my defibrillator wire was broken. And I tried to have another procedure to remove that broken wire, and it snapped off. And they tried to remove it another way, and that failed too. And it was just this incredibly traumatic time. And during that same period is when I learned the essay would be in Best American Essays. So my journey from publishing an essay that got attention to writing a book was this totally bizarre sort of career explosion and spotlight combined with total personal collapse and trauma and literal life or death questions, which is interesting in the sense that I think I was able to do things that a lot of people either move more slowly on or never take the risk, because I literally thought I would be dead. And I don't know if I recommend that way of living, but I think it's really, there's like just this particular mark on this book and the way it had to be written. So in 2016, I was sort of non-functional in figuring out what to do with my wire. And Best American Essays came out, and I started hearing from editors at Norton and Simon & Schuster. And the editor at Simon & Schuster offered to connect me with agents who might like my work. And I didn't take him up on it until the spring of 2017, when I knew I might be having open heart surgery later that spring in order to get this broken wire out. And I actually had this conversation with my friend, the writer Francisco Cantu, about like, what are the things I want to do in case I die? And it was like, sign the agent. Okay. So my agent was luckily very patient while I fought for access to the healthcare I needed, and went to the Mayo Clinic, and then learned that the wire in my heart is more messed up than we thought and couldn't be removed in the ways we thought it might be able to. And so we paused, and I took this last minute work in Costa Rica, and my agent came back to me and was like, I want to sell your book this fall. We need to write this proposal. And so unlike Kelly, I had to write my book proposal in about 10 days. I had applied to 17 residencies over the previous few years and had never gotten into one. And I had just gotten into the Mesa Refuge in California. So I went to the Mesa Refuge. I wrote this book proposal in 10 days. Bonnie like sort of carried me across the finish line. I mean, she really like looked at Shock to the Heart and started peeling sentences out of it. And then looking at some of the other drafts and material, I'd written like some research summaries for her. And she would be like, I think you can put this here, and then this from this here, and then this from this here. And she knew, of course, that I would smooth it out and sort of develop it. But she really gave me this enormous hand up at a moment that I was not that functional, because she believed in this project. And she was like, let's get you the money. Like, let's make sure you're supported to write it. And so we sold it in November of 2017. And it was supposed to be due March 1st of 2019. So it would have been a year and 3 months. And that is not what happened. This book was just so excruciating to write, both because of the trauma and the slow way it had to process through my body in order to come out. And also because, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, this book is partially about the global supply chain of the implanted cardiac defibrillator. It's me measuring what it takes to save a life and what my own life is worth. And so that reckoning occurs both within the American healthcare system and in this global context. And I had just all of this research that it was very confusing and complicated to try to get into a voice that would work alongside these very intimate, like medical trauma portraits. And trying to figure out a way, you know, this was not an essay collection. So it really had to adhere to a single arc in a way that packed the punch I wanted it to punch. And so I ended up not turning in my first draft until November 11th of 2019, and then got revisions into them March 16th of 2021. Was still doing my copy edits into July of this year. And they really like rushed the production forward for me to release on November 10th. So this book was really slow, not related at all to In Praise of Contempt topically, but In Praise of Contempt really opened the door for people to believe in my voice as an essayist and to think that I had a platform, you know, whatever that means in this industry. And maybe interestingly, we did try to sell a book about sex at the same time as Lightning Flowers. In Praise of Contempt is an essay about sex. I don't think I said that. And so that didn't actually work out. And that'll be maybe something that we probe into in a little bit.
That's great. Thank you. So one thing I'd be curious to know, I'm going to go to Kelly here with this question, is, Kelly, I was reading a few of the interviews that you've given about the book, and inevitably the sort of subject of the essay comes up. And in one of them, you talked a little bit about how, well, I'll just read the quote, right? I think there's a certain comfort in essays because you can always leave out what you don't want to deal with. I knew that writing a memoir was going to require telling the entirety of my story, or as much of it as I could. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of the complicated nature of moving from the one more elliptical potential form to the longer memoir form. Like what were the things, for those that haven't read the essay in a while, maybe, what were the things that ended up becoming much more important to the mode of the book? Is it a lot of the childhood material? I think is part of that, is my understanding.
Yeah, it's really more of the childhood material, because I felt that it was very necessary with the book, that I don't think you can tell a story of domestic violence and contain it in the moment in which it happened. Domestic violence is not built in a vacuum. It's not built in an individual relationship. It's built in cultures. It comes from comes from our family, it comes from our community, it comes from patriarchy, it comes from the country that we live in. And so I really wanted to show the hometown that I grew up in and how that shaped me. So for those who don't know, I grew up in a really, really rural Mormon town in Idaho. There's one person per square mile in the entire county. It was very conservative. And then my family, we just had, I knew I was going to have to write about my issues with my parents. I actually worked really hard to present my mother sympathetically while also showing the ways that she kind of fucked me up. She's never going to watch this recording, but if she does, she wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that. I think some readers kind of didn't recognize me trying to balance that line and thought I was actually being hard on her. And I will say that's not the case. But also when I really got blocked with the proposal, and this was because I didn't know where I wanted it to go. And I will say this as an aside, I didn't realize when I was writing my proposal that your proposal is just a suggestion, that once you place the book, you don't have to stick to the proposal necessarily. But I knew I was really blocked. I didn't know where I wanted the book to go. And I had received a fellowship to the A Room of Her Own Foundation Writers Retreat in New Mexico. And I did a workshop with Joy Castro. And she asked us to write about the hardest thing that anyone's ever said to us, or the most hurtful. And for me, it was my father, who had always been my hero, saying, Kelly, I just don't know what to believe. And later when I conferenced with Joy individually, she said, you just have to write, if you want this book to be the book you want it to be, you have to write about how your father failed you. And that's not an easy thing to write, especially when, you know, I love my father. And so it's easy to maybe, like, I'm divorced from Caleb. I don't think I villainized Caleb in the book, but if I wanted to villainize him, there would be not that much consequence for me personally, although we share a child, but I don't villainize him. But my family is still my family. So it was a real kind of, I had to walk a really delicate balance there.
Yeah. I would say, you know, I found him both the treatment of, I mean, really the treatment of Caleb and your mom and dad to be, I thought, very fair, like thoughtful, complex. Caleb is treated better than he probably deserves.
For sure.
And like I mean, there is the way, one of the ways that the book is wonderful is it because it does bring all of this other stuff to kind of bear on the questions that are kind of like implicit, maybe, as you suggested in the essay. And it's like, I mean, it strikes me as a much, I mean, both seem hard. It seems very difficult personally and emotionally to write the essay in the first place, but then also to expand the scope of the book in the way that you did, to pull all of this stuff into it.
Yeah, it was really hard. You know, you talked about at the beginning of the book, it's saying it was, how it says it was adapted from It Will Look Like a Sunset. But though that's true, they're really totally different. It Will Look Like a Sunset was about why I stayed with my ex-husband who abused me, which was that I was in love with him. Goodbye, Sweet Girl is about what it's like to be a girl in America, which is why I fell in love with a man who abused me. So these are it's just a whole, it's much more complicated. And there's so much I could have said in the book. Like I said, for me, I really emotionally, like, I was on the verge of breakdown at the end of it. I really needed to finish it. And so I'm doing a lot of the material that I think I could have continued in the book, in the essays that I'm working on now. I'm working on a collection of essays. And for myself psychically, it's just, no one wants to read two memoirs for me anyway, but it gives me a little bit more opportunity. Well, I don't want to be that person who writes two memoirs, but it gives me a little bit of opportunity with the essays to kind of look at subjects from more of a distance.
Could you talk more about like what you mean by that person that writes two memoirs? Because
I don't want to have, I mean, it's not that I think there's anything wrong with writing two memoirs. I don't want to have the kind of life that merits two memoirs. Like, I've lived enough life at this point. I'm happy to just be peaceful and calm and not have something that merits another memoir at this point.
That is some truth, Kelly.
Katie, do you want to talk about the way in which like the scope, I mean, you explored this to some degree. And I remember like part of, originally this was your MFA thesis project, was to do this sort of this research memoir, which you had to abandon part of the way in like understanding correctly that the scope of it was just way beyond your ability to get done in the time frame that you had. So would you talk a little bit of more about like that process of admitting more into the book and admitting yourself that the book was like so big that you couldn't do it while doing this other thing?
Yeah, I love the succinctness with which Kelly is able to tease out those two questions, because to me, a good work is always focused on one central question. And the questions in Shock to the Heart and Lightning Flowers are different. Shock to the Heart was about what it meant to take lightning inside me. I mean, it really positioned my experience with studies of how much electricity damages the heart and different ways people die and what the lightning flowers look like on your body and what different cultures think of getting struck. And it's not that those things didn't go into the book Lightning Flowers in slivers, and actually the title Lightning Flowers comes from one of those sections that was repeating in Shock to the Heart. It was the more poetic section that was seeking a spiritual meaning in taking the shocks. But there's one little phrase at the end of Shock to the Heart that really became Lightning Flowers. And it's where I'm saying, like, what is this even in my body? Is it a cache of copper from the Congo? And there's just a lot of mystery for me around how this particular question landed in my body the way it did. I can sort of talk about the breakdown, and I do in Lightning Flowers, of like why I think I'm the person who got this question, but ultimately it really was sort of a supernatural experience to just have this question land in my body so clearly as I'm lying there looking at the sky and smelling my own burned tissues. And that question was about whether or not it was worth it to save my life, given what it had taken. And that is a different question from this little essay, Shock to the Heart. And Shock to the Heart, I feel like, was the first stage of my training in how to write about medically dense, terminology-laden concepts. It's interesting to think about the ways in which the prologue is similar to or different from the essay Shock to the Heart, because so many lines are stolen from there, or turns of phrase. There was absolutely the poetic heart of it was intact. And yet I didn't yet know how to offer simply, to kind of render elegantly things that were really hard to explain. I'm not a science person, and which makes it so crazy that I wrote this book. So I was driven onward by the question. The MFA gave me a lot of room to be very broad about it. I got a grant my first summer, the summer between my first and second years, where I just was on a lot of mining databases, reading about the different minerals. I'd spent a long time trying to track down what were the minerals in my body, and then what are the best and worst case scenarios for each one, and paying attention to where is the story here. It was all over the place. I visited mines all over the American West. None of them were sort of speaking to me in the way that felt like it had a center of gravity. And so long before I thought I would die, 2016 is where a lot of my health stuff kicked in terms of tightening the interval at which the book needed to occur. But just being in an MFA program and thinking it was my thesis was probably really good for me in terms of a light under the ass. A lot of us, if we're just living life, you don't have those compartments of pressurization where you really get stuff done. And I ended up crowdfunding research to this particular mining project that had sort of announced itself to me as the one that contained the right combination of questions. And the reason I crowdfunded it was I only have a semester left. I've got to do this. I can't wait around and get rejected for grants. And then, of course, it was weeks after I got back from that trip. So by July of 2014, and I graduated in December, that I was like, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and this is going to take a lot longer. I don't know how to work with this material. I don't know what to conclude from it. And of course, now I know that like half the content of the book hadn't even elapsed yet, which is humbling to know. So ultimately, that question remained intact. But as things changed in my personal life, I came to understand the questions I had about the worth of my own life and what type of life we want to live, that medical technology enables or not. Those questions sharpened over on the American healthcare side, whereas I had thought they were only about the mining side. And, you know, part of getting to the finish line was figuring out how to make those work together. But I think it would have been a very different book if I hadn't had some of the continued experiences in the healthcare system that really forced that question to get really nuanced in a way I couldn't have predicted.
I like that the way you talk about, you know, those compartments of particular pressurization, kind of when you're just like getting a lot of work done. Kelly, did you have those same compartments? Whether they're like residencies or a function of being in a PhD program, or like where did you find those?
Yeah, for me being in the PhD program, and I hate to be like, oh, I had time because I was in grad school, because I know that's a larger discussion. But for me being in the PhD program, when I went to get my PhD, so I divorced my ex-husband and moved the next day to go get my PhD. And no one thought it was a good idea. My mom was a nurse and my dad was a forester, and my stipend was going to be like $16,000, and I had primary custody of my son. But I just remember thinking, if I get onto another path, I will never be able to do this because I'll be working so hard. And so I went to get the PhD. I have a ton of student loan debt. I don't regret it. Like, it was the only way I was going to have the time to create in that way. It's a different issue, but like if you're parenting, or particularly if you're a single parent, I think you have to find ways to make your writing a priority. And for me, making it my education was the way to make it my priority. So when I was finishing the book, it was my dissertation year. So I wasn't taking any classes, and I was doing it all as my dissertation. I also did, I got a fellowship and did a residency in Belgium for 2 weeks. When I got the book advance, I was just like flush with cash because I'd never had money at once, and I just blew it all. So I went to a writer's residency in Belgium. Rebecca Solnit let me stay in her house for 2 weeks. I went to the Vermont Studio Center. I went to mineral school in Washington. Writing the book was really, as emotionally traumatic as it was like a beautiful time to just have the money and the time and the space to be able to write. And there's not a lot of times in your life that you get that opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. Katie, what were the kind of those compartments for you after you got out of academic creative writing and or like hustling with your crowdfunding and your teaching? How did you find, I mean, were they residencies? Were they also in Solnit's department? Were they something else?
They were not in Rebecca Solnit's apartment, interestingly. Although my agent was at the time Rebecca Solnit's agent, she's kind of a pressurized compartment. It's interesting. I still had some money from my Kickstarter when I graduated. There were several smaller research trips I hadn't done yet. And I also made a commitment to myself that I wouldn't teach composition at the University of Arizona, which is the job you're sort of well primed for when you graduate. And I just knew that based on my workflow as a grad student, I would not write my book if I were grading all those essays. And I think Kelly's already spoken into this space well. I do come from a place of privilege. And so I recognize that it is not a risk everyone can take to graduate from their program and be like, I'm not going to take this job that's available to me. So I did a lot more with becoming an entrepreneur, developing courses and pitching them to local literary centers, hosting classes at my kitchen table. I was writing for a local food magazine. And then I would sort of like chunk off these certain periods of time where I would go do these research trips that people had already given me money to go do. And while I was on them, I would get a lot done. I also, because I did the Kickstarter project, had this audience of people who I owed something to. And that was really important for me. And if anyone on the call other than Ander was among them, you'll know that I am a little bit stunned. We're having a virtual Kickstarter party in like 2 weeks, and then that's the end after 6.5 years. So I have written so many updates to these people, and a lot of those updates ended up becoming full chunks of text in the book. I mean, having to write up those research trips gave me a way to process my research and make meaning from them. Also, my art letters, I ended up much later writing these essayistic newsletters that allowed me to create something for public consumption out of the trauma that I was living through. And it really fleshed out some of the themes of the book that I wouldn't otherwise have crafted. So that was a piece of it. Eventually I had a bartending job. And so I would, in the years that I was worried I might die without finishing this project, I would do things like get off my shift at 10 p.m. and ride my bike to the one place in Tucson that was open late and work till 2 a.m. and like try to get chunks of this proposal done. And yeah, there just were these things I would put on my calendar that I felt obligated to do. Later, after I sold the book, those pressurized containers shifted. I actually sublet my house so that I could take residencies and link them up. And I was teaching at literary centers all over the country to try to make that work. And so I did one at the, how do you even say it? Centre de Art. That's not how you say it. It's officially like Catalan, it's in Spain. So I went and worked from this residency in Spain. Then I went to Gentel Arts in Banner, Wyoming. I went to the Carey Institute for Global Good in New York as a Logan Nonfiction Fellow. And then I actually didn't get into residencies. For the spring, my book was due and my house was still sublet. And I ended up just putting Airbnbs on my credit cards, which I still have not paid off, just for reference. And I ended up losing that house because the landlord had me move out. And so then I really entered this period of like being in my friends' houses, being in hotels, renting short-term rentals. It was all very expensive, but it did hold a space of urgency because it was literally making me broke. Like, I gotta finish this thing. So I think that's probably about that.
Excellent. So we have a few minutes if folks want to ask questions. There were a few in the chat that kind of came and went that we didn't get back to that we can talk about. Here we go. One from Cheryl, first thing. Kelly or Katie, do you want to take this question on?
I don't think that's true. I don't know, maybe Katie will just, but everyone I know who's sold a memoir has sold it on a proposal. That's my short answer.
Yeah, I think that is mostly the experience I've heard of as well. I would say, would you have written them and then shopped them to agents and publishers? I honestly would not have had the resources to complete my memoir if I had not sold it on pitch. And I just need to be real about that. Not that I wouldn't have kept working on it and chipping away at it, but in particular, the level of trauma that was in my body at the time that I was trying to tell this story meant that anytime I worked on the book, I couldn't also be working. I just could not. I kept trying, and it's part of why I left the bartending job and started teaching these intensive style weekend classes. I was sort of hurtling. I just kept my head down and didn't look, kind of as much as I could stomach it. I just didn't look at the numbers because I would never get the book written if I wasn't doing it as full-time as possible. And so even though I don't feel like The amount that I was able to sell my memoir for ultimately supported me through the whole process. It did give me that initial reserve of cash to start from, to really like take the time to assess where I was and start making some choices. And, you know, my agent got an advance on my advance at one point because my book was already super late, but I had hundreds of pages turned in. And so I don't know what to say about that. I really want to honor folks who don't have support to do trauma writing in particular, because it is really hard to do this type of work when you're supposed to be transitioning back into like showing up on time and being a human around other humans. And yeah, I feel an enormous amount of gratitude that things went in the order they did for me.
I think I would have still written mine and shopped it to agents and publishers. I was pitching to agents even before I had It Will Look Like a Sunset, and getting people who would say, you know, I'd send them my essay collection. They'd say, oh, I love this. I don't think I can sell it. I think I would have continued writing, but and up until I got my agent, it never occurred to me that I might publish a book with a big five house. So I had ambitions, but my ambitions were to, I just always thought I'd publish with a small press. And I think small presses in a lot of ways are probably better to publish with, depending on what your financial needs are. But I think I would have written my book either way. Yeah.
A couple more questions here. You want to talk about what full-time writing looks like for each of you?
Yeah, I'm happy to, especially within the context of trauma writing, which I know is a different flow than a lot of other work. A lot of the work I do now, I call myself a trauma writing doula, which is not the same as a coach, because I feel like a coach believes that there are linear processes at hand and timelines and word counts. And it's not to say that no one can or should write that way, but I do think there are stories that are born outside the linear and that require a way of approaching writing in which it's okay if you're a binge writer, which is more or less true for me. But it's also understood that like you can be on a walk and be writing. You can be working with a healer and be writing. And there's a lot for me where the flow is stopping and starting. You know, Ander noted in the chat, like people's best American essays, so often they're saying that those are the ones that just came out of them. And there's a way in which you can show up to your pages and force and force and force and push, and none of those pages are going to be of the right energy. Does that mean you shouldn't write them and get the hours in and the words in? Like, no, not necessarily. I went on a writing retreat once where for 10 days, my entire goal was to write the beginning of the book every day for 10 days. And on none of those days did I get the beginning of the book, but it is not dissimilar from the prologue I just read. Like there are chunks of it that I did co-opt over time. So for me, I think there's a real way in which I have to examine my life as primed to be able to create and hold certain things, or not primed and able to create certain things. And for me, there have been periods of my time where I wrote from 7 to 11 every morning, but especially when I was moving trauma through me, that wasn't the thing. It was a lot more about locking myself somewhere and being really kind to myself when napping needed to be a part of the process, and doing a lot of things that I called prepping it out, like going through the emails from a certain era and just like taking scraps of lines from them and looking at my medical records and like circling the quotes I needed and sort of preparing things that I didn't have the ability at that time to sync up with narrative, but like getting it all in the same place and sort of priming my mind so that at some point when I sat down, that flow could just come through and it was already organized.
So I don't write full time at this point. I am a professor I'm an assistant professor at a teaching institution. I have a heavy teaching load. I'm a single mom. And the only time I ever was able to write full time was when I had the book under contract and it was my dissertation. I don't anticipate I'll ever be able to be a full time writer again. I'm going to agree with Katie that I'm a binge writer and I write when I'm thinking. But I also want to say, just on a practical level, not everyone gets to write full time, and it doesn't mean we're not writers. I just had to accept the reality of my situation, but I still produce, I still create. I'm a creative person. I'm lucky that I found work that nourishes and sustains me, and getting to teach creative writing for me is always like helping challenge me as a writer and as a person. But yeah, writing full time is, it's financially on the logical level, it's not an easy task.
I think the thing I would pop in to also say there is that call myself a writer and say it's full time, and also spend an enormous amount of time as an entrepreneur. And I'm an adjunct professor in the MFA program at the college where Kelly also works. And so there's a way in which I tell myself the story that I'm a full-time writer. And because of my attention style, I have an intensely ADHD brain. I can't hold down a 40-hour week job and write in the evenings and weekends. That's never going to be reality for me. And the way that I have made that work is to call myself a writer first, and have these sort of more giggy ways of being, and have clients and lump them or group them. And so it's not that I'm not doing other work a lot of the time. There's just this like mental switch that was really necessary for me. But, I've always been working on a lot of other stuff, except for, as Kelly said, sort of when the book money was most robust and supportive. And then when it runs out, you take on more clients and do more weekend classes.
So
I want to say
go
too,
ahead.
real quick, I think that having the bravery to call yourself a writer, I don't remember when I did that. Maybe it was when I sold my book, when people would say, "What do you do?" And I'd say, "I'm a writer." I just think there's a certain amount of power in just taking that label and owning it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's probably a good place for us to end for the time being, because we've already run a little bit over our allotted time, because there's so much to talk about here. I know we didn't get to all the questions in the chat. If you have others, and some of those, I may try to follow up with Kelly and Katie to see if they want to answer a few more for the Essay Daily interview that we're hoping to put together from this. But if you have more, you're welcome to drop me a line at ander@arizona.edu. I'm happy to post them to our panelists, who have been very generous with their time and energy, which does take a lot. It takes time out of their next books for them to come meet with us here tonight, which I'm very appreciative of. So thank you both to coming tonight. Please buy their books if you have not done that already. Go check out the Essay Daily Advent Calendar. There's lots of great stuff too. If you're someone that is a very part-time writer, having Advent as a ritual is a useful thing to, I find like daily rituals, dailynesses, very useful opportunity to reconnect with prompts and with reading, and all that kind of process is very useful. We'll also have a couple more in this series in the spring, including an event with Nicole Walker and Matthew Gavin Frank, who both have new books coming out in the spring, as well as some interviews and conversations with folks writing for the March Exodus Project. If you go to marchexodus.org, there's another nerdy thing that many of us get up to in the month of March. But that's a long ways away. In the meantime, you have an evening still to enjoy, and two really good books here to read if you've not bought them already. So please, thank you so much to Kelly and Katie, and thank you all for coming this evening. We will see you next time. Ciao.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And I want to let you know you're the first people to see me with bangs.
Pandemic problems.
I love, is that a little green streak that you're kind of rocking? Yeah,
it's kind of growing out, but the pandemic, I've been getting bored and doing stuff that no one can see except on Zoom.
That's awesome.
Thanks, Ander. Thanks, Katie.